again, okay?
Thank
But
you.
but it's a very valid question. Now you have to realize that when it comes to Talmud Torah, um, anyone is we want to create as many opportunities for Talmud Torah as possible, right? So here, let me just share the screen here. We want to create as many opportunities for Talmud Torah as possible. And as a result, there's generally no limitation on schools setting up shop next to other schools. And remember, we said that there's no problem of asagas gavul, of encroachment, with setting up as many synagogues and schools as possible for Torah and mitzvah opportunities for people to do. The issue at hand over here in particular is that there is a private relationship, business relationship that has already been established between a, a, a contractor, a Torah educator, and a particular individual who's paying for those services. And so I believe it's quite different here than setting up a new school, because here you're encroaching on a person's parnasa, specifically in his specific unique relationship with that one person. Remember, we saw yesterday that the second half of this halacha is that a balabayas who sees a malamed teaching for Ruvain's kids is allowed to, like Shimon is allowed to go over to the malamed and say to him, I'm interested in hiring you for my kids. And you are allowed to poach that teacher if you want to teach your kids. You can tell him, I'm interested in your services. So why is that okay? Isn't that unfair to Reuven and his kids? So we'll see. There is a double standard. On the one hand, the malamed is not allowed to encroach on another malamed's parnasa, but one balabayas is allowed to encroach on another balabayas's tutor. And as we'll see, this is unique to issues of Talmud Torah. We'll talk about poaching employees in general, but here, when it comes to specifically a malamed, I think we'll see that it's different, because Talmud Torah is so important that we give everyone a right to try and obtain the best educator possible. Okay, so for those two reasons, Shmuel, I think that there won't be any restrictions on setting up a new school. But let's see. Let's see if we can get. Let's finish this Sif Yud Beis, and we had just seen Sif Katan Nun Hey yesterday. That the second Malamed is not allowed to make efforts to try and get the Balabayas, who already has a Malamed in his employ, to try and get him to fire his current Malamed, or just not renew him for the new year, and to hire him instead. Okay, and here in Nun Vav, we're going to see something new, a new condition. You should not try to get him to fire the current Malamed at the end of his work contract and not renew him. And Yesh Omrin, so the Imrei Yaakov says there are those who say, Dezed dafka b'malamed shesachro valabayas b'yishuv b'makom shelo nimtza malamdim v'chaburas anashim. He says there are those who opine that this halacha of the Rab Shulchan Aruch that he just told us, which is based on the Shulchan Aruch, is only true when this is a place where, like a small shtetl, or an out-of-town community, where there are not a lot of teachers available, and there are not a lot of people, not a lot of frum people available at all. And so therefore, there's a unique relationship that's already been established between this teacher and this balabayas. And a new malamed wants to come along and get this guy thrown out of town, basically, because this malamed is not going to be able to find work that easily if he stays in the shtetl. The azmistama das hamalamed lo azman echad haya. He says, because then we can assume that when this malamed came to town, comes to the small little shtetl, and he parked himself there, rented a house or bought a house, he did it with the intention that he was going to stay for an extended period of time. And that's the why he's like an ani hamahapich b'charara. He's prospected in a certain small community, and you want to come along and toss him out of that small community. And that's the reason why it's problematic for a second educator to come and try to get the guy no longer renewed after, let's say, one term or one school year, whatever it is. But if you're living in a larger metropolitan community, presumably Toronto would qualify, where there are many people, there are many educational opportunities, and people regularly hire tutors and teachers for fixed periods of time, and then the teacher will move on to another school or to another vocation in education. In that situation, if someone presents himself to the balabayas and says, I just want you to know that I'm available if you're interested in hiring me, Eino nikra ani mahapich b'churara. He says that's not a problem, because there's just so many opportunities and so many, it's such an open market where if this guy is not renewed, the first guy is not renewed, he'll find something somewhere else. Ach ze amur im maskir atzmo miyad achar kolos mano shel ze kodem sheyesh hochacham sheze rotze umahapech lishar lahaba. But that's only true if the second educator presents himself immediately at the conclusion of the first person's period, and there's no yet indication that the first teacher is even interested in extending his work period. And it's also okay if he presents himself to say, I'd like to know if you have any future positions available. I would be available if you were interested. But if the first educator plants himself in the house of the balabayas, and again, we're talking about private tutors, where it was customary to live with the people that you were working for, and the first person, sticks around and indicates that he's planning to stay for a longer period. And certainly if the balabayas has expressed his intention to retain him for the future, so then it goes back to the original problem, that you're trying to take away something that a person has been prospecting upon and is trying to hold on to. So again, there are going to be various situations that will change this. Today in schools, you generally know by March, let's say, if you'll be offered a contract for the coming year. What is a teacher allowed to present himself to a school and say, I don't know if you're hiring for next year, but I'm interested in working for your school? I mean, if we were to take this halacha seriously and apply it to schools, then how could anyone ever drop off a resume to a principal and say, I'd like you to hire me for the next school year? And so here in the Biurim, he points out, he quotes the same thing that he quoted before. Let's see. He says, "Ulafizeh." If you take a look where I have my hand pointer, "Ulafizeh muter leilech lemenahel Talmud Torah be'emtza hashana." According to what we've just said, it would be permissible to go to a principal of a school in the middle of the year, ulahatzia atzmo betur melamed l'shana haba, and to present yourself as someone who's interested in procuring employment for the next year. ובפרט דייתכן שהמנהל מעוניין במלמד נוסף. And it could always be that the principal is interested in hiring an additional teacher. Maybe the classroom size has changed. Maybe there are more kids who have enrolled in the school, you know. Or it could be that the principal had already been planning to not renew one of his staff that already has been working there. Right, okay. But so you see what he says is that the only time that there's a problem is if there's a personal business relationship already. Okay, let me just see. Again, it's a little bit ambiguous. Here in the Likutin, he says, he quotes from the Ramah. In the Likutin over here, he says, you're not allowed to assert yourself to the balabais if he's already retaining another tutor. Avol mutra lamalamdim likvoa atzman bi'ir acheres ve'ein hamalamdim hayishanim yacholim linchot biyadam b'taina shemekatlim parnasasam al yedei zeh. If a new Malamed wants to show up one day in the city, in the town, and say, Ich bin da, I'm here. If anyone wants to hire me, you're welcome to. That's permissible. They're not directly encroaching on the person's parnasa. It may be a threat that a new young guy has come to town and he comes to shul, meets up with people. He's a real schmoozer, lets people know that he's available now as a new tutor. That's okay. He's not going to anyone specifically and trying to take away their parnasa. And even though it might even be a small shtetl, if a guy shows up one day and says, well, I'm here, I've come to try my luck in this new town. There's nothing wrong with that. You can't stop him from coming. And then he says, Sofer shirotza likvoa atzmo b'makom sheyish kvar sham sofer. Let's say you have a new sofer who comes to town, a new scribe comes to town, and he wants to set up shop and put up a shingle that he's a sofer. But the little shtetl already has a sofer, and he's already writing all the mezuzahs and the sifrei Torah that this little shtetl needs. So in that situation, the poskim say that if he's going to end up taking away the parnasa of the first sofer, then he's not allowed to just set up shop. But if there's room for both of them to profit, so then there's nothing wrong with it. It all depends on the size of the market, and it could very well be that, one sofer could say, hey, I'm not happy that you set up shop here in Thornhill as a new sofer. I'm taking you to Basin. The Basin could very well turn around and say, well, Thornhill is big enough to support more than one sofer. So here, it's different from a guy who just shows up to be an educator, because an educator could say, well, there's plenty of opportunities for private tutoring, and the community can get more than one tutor, right? But with a sofer, perhaps there's a more limited market, and that's why there's a difference. A Rosh Yeshiva shelo kol yachol liishtavot im menahalei hayeshiva uporash ve'asel atzmo yeshiva. So here Shmuel is similar to your situation. You have a Rosh Yeshiva, a head of a school, a head of a yeshiva, and he was not able to negotiate or settle properly with the Menahalei HaYeshiva, with the administrators, and they just don't see eye to eye. And so he decided to leave, and he started his own yeshiva, the Lokachimo, and he takes with him Ha-Talmidim. He basically takes all the students with him. And so this happens quite often. U'menahalei hayeshiva to'anim shenigram lehem al yedei zeh nezek, and they claim that there's been damage caused as a result to their yeshiva. This has happened so many times, where a Rosh Yeshiva leaves a larger yeshiva, starts his own. There's a yeshiva called Itri in Israel, very old yeshiva, very established yeshiva, and a couple of the rebellion decided to start their own yeshiva. So they called it, instead of Itri, they called it Splitry, because it was a split off from the first yeshiva. And then from that yeshiva, there was another yeshiva that split off. They called it Split 3. And so, this happens quite often. So can they make such a claim for damages that as a result of your starting your own yeshiva, you've poached our students and you've caused us financial loss? He says, Ayin Shailos Chuvas Lahoros Nasan, Chelek Dalet Siman Kuf Yed Ches. So maybe we'll take a look at that tomorrow. We'll take a look at that tshuva. So, but let's continue on and see when the tables are turned, and it is the Balabayas who is seeking to hire a new Malamed. And so, Aval Balabayas, like we saw the latter part of the halacha, Aval Balabayas Shesacher Malamed Echad. Mutter LeBalabayas Acher Liskor Oto Malamed Atzmo Lebanav. He says it is not considered illegal poaching for one balabayas to go over to a tutor and say, I'd like to hire you to teach my children and come work for me instead of working for the other guy. He says that is permitted. There's no prohibition of encroaching in that case. Because like we said yesterday, when there's a unique opportunity and you're basically telling someone that I can't find anyone as good as you to teach my children. So we said there in many instances, there's no problem of hasagas gavul if this is a unique opportunity where you can't find this item and it's a very valuable item anywhere else, even though the first person was prospecting on it, you are allowed to take it from him as long as it's hefker. In this situation as well, you have a contractor, free contractor, who is now finishing his term with the first guy, and you say to him, "I want you to come to work for me instead when you're finished your term with the first guy. Come and work for me. I'll pay you more, whatever. I'll make the deal more attractive for you." And the reason why he's allowed to do that is because it's very difficult sometimes to find a Malamed who will be able to teach your children Torah properly. And so it has to be unique, and it also has to be, it seems to be, that there's special exception made because it's a mitzvah to teach your children Torah. So let's take a look at the Imrei Yaakov. Here, okay, so ve'ein bazeh mishum hasagas gavul. So the Imrei Yaakov says, umayri. Let me just see where are we up to over here. Right, we said that there's no problem of hasagas gavul if you hire the malamed to work for you instead of working for the other guy. Umayri kishapasak imodamim avalo gamar adayin schiruso shelo asukinyan aval ba'asukinyan asu. That's if there's been no contract signed between the malamed and the first guy. They may have already come to terms, and they've already agreed upon in principle to have this business arrangement. But if there's been but the deal has not been consummated yet. There's been no signed contract. There's been no kinyan yet. And there, you have to go back to our first discussion with Mechusar Amana, where a person may be considered acting in bad faith by going back on a deal, but it does not speak to any prohibition of another person attempting to try and poach this educator and bring him for his own family. And the reason why there's no hasagas gavul here is because she'ein yachol limso malamid moel levanav kazeh, because he can argue, I can't find as good an educator anywhere else as you, and I need to teach my children Torah. The bahasbaras halimud v'iyuno ein hamalamdim shavim, and as we know clearly that when it comes to education, not all teachers are alike. Every teacher is unique, and every teacher has unique teaching abilities. And as we learned before, when it comes to a unique mitzia, something that is unique from Hefker and is very valuable, there are many poskim who say that there is no din of ani and mahapich b'chorara. But if you recall, going back to Siman Yud, to Seif Yud, the Rav Shulchan Aruch still was not so happy about a person who does this. But apparently, dispensation is being granted because there is such a high premium on teaching your children Torah that we allow additional competitiveness and even poaching when it comes to getting the best educator possible for your children. And I just wanted to show you that and take a look quickly at the Imrei Yaakov over here, at the Biurim over here. He says this psak that we allow poaching as long as the contract has not been signed yet for educators is davar zeh. He says nifsak b'shulchan aruch sof siman reish lamed zayin u'mekoro midivrei hatosvos kiddushin nun tesam and aleph shekas v'vizel l'shana. He says this is based upon the Shulchan Aruch, which is based on the Tosfos commentary to Kiddushin, who writes as follows: Aval im socher balabayis malamed echad. If, let's say, Reuven balabayis 1 hires himself a teacher for his children, Yachol balabayis acher liskor osa malamed atzma. It is perfectly okay for Shimon, the second balabayis, to hire that same teacher. And Reuven can't turn to Shimon and say, "Hey, get away from my tutor and go find your own tutor." Because Shimon could say to him, "I only want this tutor. He's perfect for my kids. My kids get along with him. They relate to him, etc." Basically, that's the argument. Because the second balabayas, Shimon, can say, it seems to me that he's going to do a much better job in teaching my kids than anyone else. He says, V'hinei divrei hatosfos tzrichim biur. He says, this really needs clarification, what Tosfos is communicating. Demashma shelo brira leklal shemalamed zetov me'acher v'lo yimtza kamahu v'afilu hachimutar. He says, it seems like, from the way Tosfos is phrasing his claim of the second balabayas, is that the second balabayas is essentially claiming, it seems to me that this teacher will teach my kids better than anyone else. Because he says, kimedumali. Kimedumali means, it seems to me, it appears to me, that this teacher will be better than anyone else. And he doesn't know for sure. No one knows anything for sure. A lot of times you look at a guy and he seems like the best, coolest educator. And then when he actually sits down with your child, there's no chemistry whatsoever. So even though there's not certainty, the second guy still can say, I want to hire this guy. Because he could say, it appears to me that this teacher is going to be better. He says, and it's amazing that this is okay. He says, because you can make that argument with any kind of merchandise. You could say, I don't have a problem poaching your employee. I don't have a problem poaching the merchandise that you've already worked so hard in negotiating for, because I don't think I'm going to find such good merchandise anywhere else. So where does it stop? Where is the concern for the propriety of ani hamahapich b'chorara? You have to let a guy who's already prospected on something, give him the opportunity to finish his relationship. Umatzasi b'sefer minchas pitim choshen mishpat siman reish lamed zayin sif aleph shehirgish bazeh v'kasav l'taretz v'zel l'shana. And he says in the sefer minchas pitim, which is a relatively recent sefer which we've referenced before on Choshen Mishpat, he also is bothered by this, and he writes as follows: V'nira shahatosvos lamdu ke'mehad isa be'avodah zara yud gimel demuter l'kohen leilech derech beis hapras lilmod Torah. He says this is based on the fact that there are many leniencies that are dispensed for the sake of studying Torah. This is not, you cannot extrapolate this halacha about poaching an educator to any other industry or to any other kind of transactional relationship. He says because there's a special halacha that there's a kind of real estate called Beis HaPras. A Beis HaPras is a field where we believe someone is buried there because we found some remains scattered through the field of human remains. Okay? And there's a halacha that the rabbis made that a Kohen is not allowed to walk through that field, even though it's extremely unlikely that he's going to be traversing the exact spot where the human remains are. The rabbi said that a Kohen may not traverse that field out of the remote concern that he may end up coming in contact with human remains, and is not allowed to do that, as we know. But they made a special exception that if the Kohen is on his way to study Torah, is on his way to the yeshiva, and it would take him an extra several minutes to have to walk around the field in order to go to the yeshiva, he has permission to walk through the Beis HaPras in order to shorten his path to get to the yeshiva. Va'afilu yesh lo mimi lilmod b'makomo, and that's true even if the Kohen can actually learn Torah without traveling to the yeshiva. The low mikol adam zocheh lilmod, because when it comes to Talmud Torah, sometimes it's very difficult to find someone appropriate for you to learn from. I might feel that I'm connecting with Rabbi so-and-so, but I don't connect with this rabbi who may be more local. So therefore, special dispensation is granted that if you need to travel, and in the course of that travel, you may encounter an Isser D'Rabbanan like this Beis HaPras, we will suspend that prohibition to enable you to study Torah from the rabbi that you feel you will be able to connect with and you will be able to study Torah from. And v'hachi kaimelan b'yoredei simin shem ayin beis, and this is how we paskin elsewhere in the Shulchan Aruch. And what we see from there is that harei da'afal gav d'shnei hamalamdim shavim b'chachma, even though the two educators may be completely equivalents in their Torah knowledge, afilu hachi imritzono leilech lilmod eitzel zeh, hitiru chachamim leilech derech Beis HaPras. But if this particular gentleman wants to go to a faraway place to go seek out the educator from whom he feels he'll be able to connect with and be able to learn from, we allow him to do so, even if he's going to end up walking through this Beis HaPras. Mishum delo mikol adam zocheh lilmod, because of the principle that you don't necessarily learn from every person. I can tell you my own personal experience. There were people who are great Talmidei Chachamim, who I simply could not draw their educational lessons from because I just didn't connect with their style. And I'm sure the same thing is true. There are certain people who hear me speak and what I'm saying doesn't resonate with them. They prefer a different kind of language, or they prefer a different kind of presentation. And there are other people that the education does resonate with, right? Everyone is different. And that's the reason why in our scenario, we learn the same situation, that I'm allowed to try and get the best educator for my children because it's a unique find, which I may not find anywhere else. And that's why this halacha is only true for a Torah teacher and not for any other industry. So like I see, we have some professionals. Let's say you're part of a medical practice, and the administrator of the medical practice has worked very, very hard in assembling a team of doctors, and he's invested a lot of time and a lot of effort and even a lot of money in getting a group of what he considers to be a crack medical team to be part of his medical group. There, it would be more problematic, according to halacha, to try and poach one of those doctors for your medical group instead of the medical group that they're already at. If in a situation where you want to abide by halacha, because this is not the same thing as a Torah teacher. Gam yesh lomer d'melamed shiny d'mitzvah kavod. And you could also make the argument because he's doing a mitzvah. The Afal Gav, the Rashal B'tshuva Siman Lamavav Kasav De'ein Lomar Tam Heter M'Melamed Mishum Mitzvah, the Ha Yedezem Nigra Chaver Mitzvah, Lanias Daiti Yesh Ladin Bazeh. He says, and even though one of the commentaries, the Maharshal, says that what about the fact that you're going to be depriving the first guy's kids of an education, right? He says, but it seems to me that this is still a valid argument. He says, "V'ayin sham le'el de'evi b'shem atosis daha shari b'melamed hana mishum she'en darken shel b'nei adam lachazor l'chapes achem melamdim v'lo nucha lomar zil terach ayin sham." He says there's a lot to deliberate over here. Number one, the fact that there's a mitzvah involved in getting your children educated. You're not obligated to make sure that the other guy's children are educated. You're obligated to make sure that your children are educated. And therefore, apparently, greater weight is granted to a free enterprise than respecting everyone's space when it comes to procuring a Torah teacher for your children. Does it apply to other industries where you could make the argument that this is the only person that's available? So this is the controversial part. For some people it may, for other people it may not. Okay, to be continued. We will continue this subject in Yirtzeh Hashem tomorrow.